Welcome to the BiCurean podcast.
I'm Aicila,
And I am Erik.
and this week we're going to talk about he is having a baby.
He is having a baby.
Mm-hmm.
I have questions.
Do you have questions?
I do.
Well,
They taught me at a young age that that's not how it works.
you know, a lot of us were taught that, and we're gonna tease our audience for a little bit, and we're not gonna dive right into that. We're gonna talk about some concepts first.
We can do that.
I'm hopeful that you'll join me in this process.
we have some concepts we can go over.
So, one of them is the gender binary.
Yes,
Do you know what that is?
I do. But I've had that as a personal experience in my life and something that I figured out for myself in a lot of different ways over time. But I don't know that everyone else does.
Okay, so should I read this Wikipedia quote?
Wikipedia,
Yeah.
where all the facts are.
Oh, I don't know, but I thought they did a pretty good job of
I like this quote.
breaking it down. The gender binary, also referred to as gender binaryism, is a classification of sex and gender into two distinct, opposite, and disconnected forms of masculine and feminine.
That's a thing.
That's a thing.
What I find most interesting about it is, I feel like it's only been in the last few years that people have really started paying attention to the concepts of gender binarism. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. Binarism.
Binaryism. Yeah.
And a lot of it comes from, I think, trans people being in the news a lot more lately,
Mm-hmm.
and this realization that there is a binarism going on, and now all of a sudden people want to switch in it, and it's always been there. I remember I was in middle school, probably in the late 80s, and everybody was making a big deal because there was a transgendered woman on the school board, and the whole area around here, in the particular school district in around Denver that I was going to, was just put off by it. And that was the late 80s. So that was like my first experience of, oh, that's something that people can change. It involves surgeries and a whole bunch of other things. But if you are a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa, apparently you can get that fixed. Good to know.
Good to know. Yeah, I do think that, so my history, of course, is working in the LGBT community for a very long time. So I do feel that it's been relevant in that community not relevant. It's been relevant everywhere. It's been more talked about in the non-mainstream LGBT queer community.
I would agree, because that's when I started hearing more about it.
For
was
much
when
longer.
I got more involved in the queer community.
And it's interesting that so this binary concept is this masculine, feminine, disconnected way of viewing gender, and is pervasive in ways that once you start to notice it can become overwhelming. So because you think about it, like when someone's pregnant, is it a boy or a girl? It's one of the first questions people ask.
Right.
Because for some reason that matters.
It does, I think, mostly because people need to know what colored toys and clothing to bring to the baby shower.
Because right.
Which is funny, because I think that's primarily the purpose of it, but it does have a more pervasive kind of thing going on about it.
Well, and an interesting side note is that the toys and the colors around gender is actually a marketing thing that the clothing industry implemented, I want to say in the 50s.
Right.
It used to be that young children, regardless of gender, were dressed in these little white dresses until
Always
they
white
were.
in all the old pictures.
Yeah.
It was always white. Yep.
And well, you know why? Because you can bleach white,
Right.
so you can get it cleaner.
It's functional.
It's very functional. I mean, we don't think of it as functional because it gets dirty, but it also is easier to clean.
Right.
So they get, up until they were 4 or 5 years old, and it was actually considered to be offensive to put children in pants and to draw attention to the fact that they might have a gender or genitalia in some way. That was socially inappropriate.
That makes an odd amount of sense based on what I know of puritanical times and various different
The
points in
clothing
history.
industry figured out that they could sell twice as many clothes if they marketed the importance of gendering your child as young as possible.
Wow.
And that's what happened. And originally, it was blue was for girls, pink was for boys, because pink was a muted form of red, which was considered to be too aggressive of a color for girls.
You are a wealth of information on this that I did not realize.
But it's fascinating, right? Like, you're like, where did this occur? I don't know why they changed the pink to girls and the blue to boys. I sort of stopped there, but it's just that. So this whole concept, right, of like having to know for this functional reason was actually a marketing campaign by the clothing industry, and they were very successful. They sell a lot more baby clothes because instead of buying like 7 white dresses for all your kids, you now buy a myriad of gender clothing for each child. Or if you're me and you're cheap, you buy a bunch of clothes for your older child, and then your younger child wears clothes of that gender. And occasionally the things that people gave them that you don't find to be too offensive.
Right. That's actually really interesting. I mean, I guess I could have guessed there was a story like that behind all of it, but yeah, I mean, the cigars you get come with pink or blue wrappers and things
Uh-huh.
like that. It's just, yeah.
It's because, and so, capitalism is the root of all evil, maybe, or that's not the point of this. So maybe we should talk about the difference between sex and
Well,
gender.
I think it's a good way to illustrate binarism,
Mm.
that culturally people just see girls and boys
Mhm.
for the most part, unless they start actually paying attention, which brings up our next point.
Oh, good segue.
What is the difference between sex and gender?
What is, or do you want me to answer that using my handy dandy reference sheet?
Yes, that I have as well. I could read just as easily, but I like hearing your voice.
Well, thank you. So the difference between sex and gender, and we often conflate them, is that sex refers to anatomy, reproductive system, and the secondary sex characteristics. And gender is often associated with our gender roles in society, or our gender identity, like our personal identity of our gender. And so there's these sort of multiple things that are squished into one concept.
Right.
And so someone might be, they call it cisgender, if your body, your sex characteristics, and your personal identification of gender and the gender roles that you take on all match.
Yes. And again, another term that I've seen more in the news, in mainstream news, cisgendered, cis male, cis female, being used again because of a lot of the things being drawn to the transgender community and the issues they've been dealing with, and just LGBT in general being in the news more.
Mhm.
But it's interesting to me because I've battled myself personally with the idea of being cis male. There's a lot of expectations. I've never felt particularly masculine. I'm comfortable in a male body, but I am, as you've become aware probably over the last several months, I am not particularly a masculine person. And in fact, I'm much more down the middle on a lot of that. So the idea of gender and how I associate that over the last many years has definitely been something that I've come to learn about in myself and accept in myself, and stop putting the pressure on myself to be one thing or the other when it comes to the gender, regardless of the fact that I'm comfortable in a male body.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that one of the things that I see as a benefit that is coming out is the education that we're getting from people who identify as trans or genderqueer. It's another different approach. So, is that we're getting more information about what is inherently sort of a sex based characteristic, which is a very small slice of things, and then a broader spectrum of what it means to have gender identity and gender roles. And more people are becoming aware of the ways in which they've adopted things that don't actually fit them, because they felt like that's what they're supposed to do. Like, guys do this. They take out the trash and watch football. And if you're in a lesbian relationship, which I was at a point, and neither of us watched football, and we took turns taking out the trash, and somehow everything was fine.
Well, and I find that even in a lot of the friendships and those sorts of things I've had in life, I've ended up with people in similar things. Um, I watch football with more women than men,
Mhm.
um, because I find that I end up in groups of people that are just more comfortable being who they are and not necessarily who society thinks they should be. And so those gender roles, that like, right off the bat is one of those things where um, I think in some ways you could almost call anybody who, tries to buck that gender queer, only because society doesn't always respect those decisions. Um,
Yeah.
but then some things do become a little bit easier. So, for example, I don't feel like watching football is a distinctly masculine thing anymore because I see a lot of women doing it. So, some of those things just start changing over time.
Yeah. And hopefully they'll continue to change. The article that inspired me to bring this topic forward is the one I referenced in my BiCurean Moment last week. It was published in The Guardian, the story of one man's pregnancy. And it addressed a phenomena that has been occurring for more than a decade that we're aware of, where trans men, so people who were born biologically female and identify as male, they've perhaps transitioned and started using testosterone, perhaps they've had surgery or not. And they definitely identify as male, often legally as male, choose to have a biological child for one reason or another. And this article is the story of one person telling their journey as both a trans person, a trans man, and a biological parent who was the one who became pregnant with the child. And what is that? And actually, he filmed it, so it's a movie you can watch. We'll link to that because I'm sure it'll be amazing. But one of the statistics they referenced in the article is they said in Australia, 54 people who identified as men gave birth in 2014.
That's a lot higher number than I would have thought, even for Australia.
That's a lot higher number than I would have thought. Like,
and Australia is just a strange place. There's lots of animals that want to kill you, and generally you shouldn't swim in the ocean there.
Right, and yeah, I mean it's a surprising number. And I know from my work in the LGBT community, I knew a gentleman several years ago who transitioned, lived as male for 2 years with his partner, and then they made the decision for him to stop his testosterone and get pregnant. And so I'd met people who had done it. I thought it was a little bit more uncommon than clearly it is. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this article and how this person talks about it is, and I think this is my observation and experience as well, is that initially people who identified as trans really had to be 100% committed to the binary in some ways. This part of the binary doesn't work for me, so I need to move to the other one.
I have known several trans people, and it has not been my experience that they do that, but that was definitely an expectation I had that was changed by knowing two people very close to me that did transition. And it makes a lot more sense, again, and that's why I brought up my own personal experience, because I completely get the idea of being comfortable or uncomfortable with your body, but then defining your gender and what you're comfortable with in relation to your mental state as a gender or gender roles as being different. And it was eye-opening for me to go through, and still going through in some cases, a transition with people that were close to me in my life.
Yeah. And there's a lot that happens there. One of the things that I appreciate that he talks about in this is that he's like, I'm a man and I'm pregnant, but I'm still a man. And that feeling of also confronting some very interesting experiences. He said, as a man, I often got read as a fat guy. So I could lift things and walk. Like no one would ever offer me a seat on the subway and that kind of thing. And I was just like, well, that's really interesting that like in a certain way, we associate, or I certainly have associated this concept of chivalry with things like acknowledging the burden of cooking a person, if you will. And and yet this person's experience was people couldn't even see that he was pregnant because they were so blinded by their expectation of his gender.
Right.
And so it's just really fascinating to me.
Well, something interesting in that quote that you had there. Um, they were at an antenatal class, and the teacher instructed all the pregnant folks to feel their hips, and he obeyed. And the man beside him gave him a nudge and said, "I don't think we have to bother, mate."
Yeah. In
I
the
mean,
prenatal class.
right. That's amazing that you will look at somebody and confirm what you expect to see about them so quickly.
Mhm.
Like, just looks like a man. I mean, for what it's worth, that's good, I guess, right? Isn't that really the goal in society, is people to just see and expect that what they see is the case, and not necessarily live in a world where people are going to overanalyze you to see just how feminine or masculine you look. Maybe you are a man in a dress. Maybe you are a woman trying to pull off the manly look. I kind of like his story.
Yeah. Well, I would say also, though, like your point around the natal class is that it would be super awesome if people could look and actually see the whole picture instead of stopping with the thing they expected. Because if he was in a prenatal class and pregnant and still being read as a man who doesn't need to follow the instructions
Right.
like that, it just points to the ways in which we have a lot of if then statements, you know? So if you're a guy, you're not pregnant, therefore you don't have to do this. So it's great that the guy who was talking to him noticed that he was a guy and he stopped there. It's just lazy. But it's a
It is
laziness we all do.
right. It is. It's lazy, but I think at some point we need to look at this from the ultimate goal of society. Right now, everybody's playing a tug of war against different things. LGBT wants, rights to get married and all of this, but then not necessarily get judged for who they are and all of these different things. And it's like, I'm all for all of that. So at what point is a situation where a trans person is no longer getting noticed and is truly being accepted for who they've transitioned to? And
Mhm.
I mean, we're talking about third grade biology class. Boys don't have babies. And so, yes, maybe an interesting and somewhat awkward moment, but realistically, I almost feel better that that person was not getting judged or overly looked at or inspected by everyone in the class as to why they were there, and was assumed to be a man, which he is.
Yeah. I think and that's what I love about the story and what this gentleman, Barker, I think his name is Scott Barker, was talking about, um, is his experience of going through this as someone who identifies as male and the complexity that that brings out. And my observation around that particular exchange is also inspired by I want to live in a society where people are accepted for who they are and as they present. And they don't, like, some part of them doesn't have to be rejected because of it.
Agreed. And I think the key there is not in this article, because when that person who said, "I don't think we have to bother," found out, oh, this person does have to bother because that's a man and they're pregnant, how did they respond? Because that's the real answer here, right?
Mhm.
If they're like, "Oh, well, that's cool," then we've won. Then that is exactly what we could want. Every situation leading up to that was pretty much an ideal situation for somebody that were immediately accepted for how they present. And if they were immediately accepted for the fact that how they're presenting does not necessarily match into the traditional guidelines that we learned in third grade biology, then that's a win.
Yeah, I can get on board with that. And we're gonna link to this and I think we should watch a movie personally. And it's just I really encourage folks to look more into this concept of not living in this binary world of gender, even if you don't necessarily identify as genderqueer yourself. There are ways in which this concept of the gender binary is a burden to us all.
I think the thing that it really, this story and what reading it really opened up for me was a reminder that it's okay. I need this reminder from time to time that it's okay to be you. It's okay for me to be a little femmy about things and not necessarily be other things. And if people don't accept that, I don't necessarily have to carry that burden. And what I go through is nowhere near as dramatic as any of this, but it's kind of interesting to see real life stories that remind me that it's okay to be who I am and to not do that. And I think that if there's any moral to any of this, sometimes I think people who are genderqueer, non-binary, trans, gay, lesbian, and even straight to an extent, can be reminded that it's okay to be you.
Yeah.
And
I like that moral.
Well, and accept other people, but be comfortable being you. Life is a whole lot easier when you're comfortable in your own skin and in your own mental state. So I do find it fantastic that this story got published and made people aware that not everything has to be black or white.
Or male or female. Welcome to our BiCurean Moment.
So I have an interesting one. I was listening to a podcast recently with an author, and it did not on its surface appear like it was going to be as fascinating as it was. It was an interview on CPR, Colorado Public Radio podcast, called Colorado Matters. Her name was Eugenia Bone, and at 55, she's a journalist, so she's been a writer and doing that her whole life. And at 55, she went back to school to study microbiology and wrote a book recently on it and has changed her life and was talking about all of this. And it was fascinating to hear a lot of her takes on this. I admit I used to be a germaphobe, and traveling for a living just breaks you of that habit real fast because everything that you're touching or doing is probably contaminated. And she had some really interesting insights into how that affects our immune system, being exposed to all of that. And so I just find it interesting that we're seeing more and more of this kind of thing coming out, and a fascinating person that presented it. So it was just very entertaining for me.
It sounds really interesting. I hadn't heard about it. So
yeah, I'll send you the podcast and we can post a link to it as well. It was interesting to hear her takes on how trying to limit your exposure to microbes is actually bad, and what we do in fear of microbes is dangerous. We're making antibacterial resistant strains of things all the time because we're so prone to just throwing antibiotics at them. And so, yeah, it's bad. But yeah, definitely recommend it. We'll put a link to it.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. So mine, I am plebeian, except when it comes to horse racing. And so it's sort of one of my inner conflicts is that I really love horse racing and I don't feel like I should because it's so elitist. And so we went to New Orleans last year and over Thanksgiving, and we went to the racetrack on Thanksgiving Day, which I have to say, I had no idea that existed as an event. Really, everyone should do it. It's ridiculously weird.
Don't they dress up there too?
They dress up. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's really... It's not plebeian at all. It's not my people, but it kind of is my people. It's a very confusing BiCurean moment. And the Kentucky Derby just occurred. So we have started officially the new Triple Crown.
Yes.
So I'm very excited to see what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. Horse racing is one of those things I was drug into in high school with my high school sweetheart, and I have followed it ever since because I have been in a saddle quite a few times. But I do find horse racing to be fascinating from a distance.
Well, so my dad races horses, and he doesn't have $1 million horses, but he had some nice ones. And I'll just never forget. I walked with this trainer. I don't know, maybe I was 15 years old, and I was walking the lines with him. And the trainer was like, "That horse is winning the first race. That horse is winning the second race. That horse is winning." And he was right. He just knew what was going to happen.
Why isn't he making a ton of money?
I don't know, but it was one of those moments where I was like, "Whoa, there's a lot going on here." And at the same time, it's not something, for the most part, people can do without the ability to invest, even in the less expensive ones. My dad, I guess, he pretty much would like break even. He didn't really make money, but he didn't lose it.
Right.
And he definitely, there's also a bunch of ethics questions about how the horses are treated and that kind of thing. So,
wait, that sounds like fodder for a future podcast.
Oh, look at that.
So thank you for listening to us this week. And as usual, please leave any comments, questions, concerns, hate mail, whatever, in the comments down below.
Please.
And we look forward to reading it.
Suggestions for future topics. We want to hear from you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.